Simon & Schuster Audio presents The Brilliant Disaster, JFK, Castro, and America's Doomed Invasion of Cuba's Bay of Pigs, by Jim Rasenberger. Read by Bob Walter.
Introduction. The Bay of Pigs thing. Back in the first half of the 20th century, America was a good and determined nation led by competent men and defended by an indomitable military. That, anyway, was a plausible view for Americans to hold 50 years ago. The First World War, then the Second World War, asserted and confirmed America's place of might and right in the world. Even in the decade after the Second World War, as a new conflict in Korea suggested there were limits to what the United States might accomplish abroad, it would have been a cynical American who doubted he or she lived in a powerful nation engaged in worthy exploits. And then came the Bay of Pigs. In the early hours of April 17, 1961, some 1,400 men, most of them Cuban exiles, attempted to invade their homeland and overthrow Fidel Castro. The invasion at the Bahía de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs, quickly unraveled. 3 days after landing, the exile force was routed and sent fleeing to the sea or the swamps, where the survivors were soon captured by Castro's army. Despite the Kennedy administration's initial insistence that the United States had nothing to do with the invasion, the world immediately understood that the entire operation had been organized and funded by the U.S. government. The invaders had been trained by CIA officers and supplied with American equipment, and the plan had been approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President of the United States. In short, the Bay of Pigs had been a U.S. operation, and its failure, a perfect failure, historian Theodore Draper called it, was a distinctly American embarrassment. Bad enough the government had been caught bullying and prevaricating. Much worse, the United States had allowed itself to be humiliated by a nation of 7 million inhabitants, compared to the United States' 180 million, and smaller than the state of Pennsylvania. The greatest American defeat since the War of 1812, one American general called it. Others were less generous. Everyone agreed on this. It was a mistake Americans would never repeat, and a lesson they would never forget. They were wrong on both counts. Mention the Bay of Pigs to a college-educated adult American under the age of, say, 50, and you are likely to be met by tentative nods of recognition. The incident still rings discordant bells somewhere in the back of our national memory. Something to do with Cuba, with Kennedy, with disaster. That phantasmagorical phrase alone, Bay of Pigs, is hard to forget, evoking images of bobbing swine in a blood-red sea. Or at least it did in my mind when I first heard it. But what exactly happened at the Bay of Pigs? Many of us are no longer certain, including some of us who probably ought to be. At about the time I began thinking about this book, Dana Perino, the White House press secretary for President George W. Bush, good-naturedly confessed on a radio program that she confused the Bay of Pigs thing, April 1961, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. Given that Ms. Perino was born a decade after these events, her uncertainty was understandable. But coming from the woman representing the president who launched the invasion of Iraq in 2003, an exercise that repeated some of the very same mistakes made in Cuba in 1961, it also was unsettling. Presumably, somebody in the Bush White House considered the history of the Bay of Pigs before sending Colin Powell to the Security Council of the United Nations, an episode, as we shall see, bearing striking similarities to Adlai Stevenson's appearance before that same body in April 1961, or ordering a minimal force to conquer a supposedly welcoming foreign land. Then again, If history teaches us any lesson, it is that we do not learn the lessons of history very well. Almost as soon as the mistakes of the Bay of Pigs were catalogued and analyzed by various investigative bodies, America began committing them again, not only in Cuba, but elsewhere in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa. By one count, the United States has forcibly intervened, covertly or overtly, in no fewer than 24 foreign countries since 1961, not including our more recent 21st century entanglements in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of these have, arguably, produced long-term benefits for the United States. Most clearly have not. The surfeit of interventions gives rise to a fair question. Considering all that has occurred since 1961, why should the Bay of Pigs still demand our attention? Next to Vietnam and Iraq, among others, the Bay of Pigs may seem a bump in the road fading mercifully in the rear-view mirror. The entire event lasted a mere 5 days and cost the United States roughly $46 million, less than the average budget of a Hollywood movie these days. 114 men were killed on the American side, and only a handful of these casualties were U.S. citizens. Add to this the fact that America was embarrassed by the Bay of Pigs, and the tale has everything to recommend it for oblivion. Even if we would forget the Bay of Pigs, though, it will not forget us. There, among the mangrove swamps and the coral-jeweled waters, some part of the American story ended and a new one began. Like a well-crafted prologue, the Bay of Pigs sounded the themes, foreshadowed the conflicts, and laid the groundwork for the decades to follow. And what followed was, in no small measure, a consequence of the events in Cuba in 1961. It would be facile to credit the 1960s to a single failed invasion. Many currents combined to produce that tsunami. But the Bay of Pigs dragged America into the new decade and stalked it for years to come. 3 of the major American cataclysms of the 60s and early 70s, John Kennedy's assassination, the Vietnam War, and Watergate, were related by concatenation to the Bay of Pigs. No fewer than 4 presidents were touched by it, from Dwight Eisenhower, who first approved the program of covert action against Castro, to Richard Nixon and the 6 infamous justice-obstructing words he uttered in 1972. The whole Bay of Pigs thing. My telling of the Bay of Pigs thing will certainly not be the first. On the contrary, thousands of pages of official reports, journalism, memoir, and scholarship have been devoted to the invasion, including at least 2 exceptional books, Haynes Johnson's emotionally charged account published in 1964, and Peter Wyden's deeply reported account from 1979. This audiobook owes a debt to both of those, and to many others, as well as to thousands of pages of once classified documents that have become available over the past 15 years, thanks in part to the efforts of the National Security Archives, an organization affiliated with George Washington University that seeks to declassify and publish government files. These newer sources, including a CIA Inspector General's report written shortly after the invasion and hidden away in a vault for decades, and a once-secret CIA history compiled in the 1970s, add depth and clarity to our understanding of the event and of the men who planned it and took part in it. If what follows is not quite a story never told, it may be, even for those well acquainted with the event, especially those, perhaps, a different story than the one they thought they knew. Because the Bay of Pigs was so cataclysmic and personally anguishing to so many involved, and because it raised questions about core American values, its postmortems have tended to be of the finger-pointing, axe-grinding, high dudgeon variety. This includes personal memoirs and reminiscences, but also serious and measured works such as Johnson's and Wyden's, both of which were colored by the circumstances under which they were written. Johnson's book, published just a few years after the invasion, was authored with heavy input from leaders of the Cuban Exile Brigade, and is raw with their pain and resentment. Wyden's book was written in the late 1970s, following Watergate and an inflammatory Senate investigation into CIA-sponsored assassinations, the so-called Church Committee, when national outrage for government subterfuge was at a high point, and esteem for the CIA hit new lows. The book announces its bias on the very first page, when Wyden describes the CIA as acting out of control during the Bay of Pigs. Many other books, articles, and interviews have added to the riot of perspective, those by Kennedy partisans who damn the CIA, those by CIA participants who damn Kennedy, those by Cuban exiles who damn both and Castro too, and those by Cuban nationals who hail the events of 1961 as a great defeat of American imperialism and a defining episode in the hagiography of Fidel Castro. With the possible exception of Castro, no one came out of the Cuban venture smelling sweet, but over time the CIA came to assume the rankest odor of all. Starting with the publication of two important memoirs by senior Kennedy aides in the fall of 1965, Arthur M. Schlesinger's 1,000 Days and Theodore Sorensen's Kennedy, a steady stream of books championed the view that John Kennedy was a victim in the Bay of Pigs, and especially a victim of the CIA's arrogance and malfeasance. Several recently published books that treat the Bay of Pigs suggest this view has won out and is now conventional wisdom. One recent bestseller, David Talbot's Brothers, The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years, 2007, describes a defiant CIA driven by cynical calculation while engaged in an effort to sandbag President Kennedy with the Bay of Pigs. Another, Tim Weiner's History of the CIA, Legacy of Ashes, 2007, portrays an agency that managed to combine duplicity with dereliction, somehow running circles around Kennedy and his advisers, even as it tripped over its own 2 feet. The more complicated truth about the Bay of Pigs is that it was not ginned up by a nefarious band of agents in the bowels of the CIA, but rather produced by 2 administrations, encouraged by countless informed legislators, and approved by numerous men of high rank and intelligence, even brilliance, who either did know or should have known what they were agreeing to. As for why they did this, how could I have been so stupid, is how Kennedy phrased the question. The answer is that all of them, from the presidents to the Central Intelligence Agency, from the Pentagon to the State Department, were operating under conditions that made the venture almost impossible to resist. At a time when Americans were nearly hysterical about the spread of communism, they simply could not abide Castro. He had to go.